Fantastic. So, hello everyone, and welcome to the Q Community's series of webinars. So my name's Emma Adams. I'm going to take you through our couple of slides just as an introduction, and then I'll introduce our speakers and our other hosts. So let me put my screen on for everybody so you can see what we're up to. So today, this is the fourth and final webinar in our series around quality management systems. And we've been organising these webinars for Q community members and their friends. And the Q community, if you don't know what it is a connected network of over 5,000 people from the UK and Northern Ireland and Ireland as well, who are all committed to working together to share, bring ideas and collaborate around improving health and care systems. So what we've been doing is we've been running a series of webinars on different topics associated with quality management systems, and today these are our guests that we've got joining us. So I'm going to ask everyone to just wave, and then hopefully we can and say hello, and then you'll see them pop up on the screen. So as I said, I'm Emma Adams. I'm a Q member, a Generation Q Fellow with the Health Foundation, and an improvement consultant that works with trusts all around the country. And my co-host is Joy. Joy, would you like to quickly just say hello?
Hello, everybody. Nice to see you all here again.
Thank you, Joy. So now you've seen what Joy looks like. So our guests for today are Ruth Glasper, Ruth's Director of Improvement Support and iHub in Healthcare Improvement Scotland. Ruth, would you just like to say hello so we can see who you are?
Hi to everyone, delighted to join you today.
Fantastic, thanks Ruth. And then we're joined by Professor John Bolton, who's Director for Quality Improvement and Patient Safety at Public Health Wales. John, would you like to say hello as well?
Yeah, hi everyone, it's good to see you all.
Thank you. And then we've got David Fillingham, who is a chair, coach, all sorts of improvement aficionados, previously associated with Chief Executive at AQuA, Royal Bolton, so knows all sorts of things about improvement, and we're delighted that he's joined us as well. So David, would you like to just say hello?
Yeah, hello everybody, thank you Emma. I'm looking forward to the conversation this afternoon, it should be good.
Fantastic. And last but not least, Penny Pereira, who's Managing Director for Q. Would you like to say hello, Penny?
Hello, it's fantastic to be here.
Great. Well, I'm hoping that you've seen everybody who's on the call today. So without further ado, just to let you know, we are recording the session. We'd like you to be on mute while we present the core material, but use the chat all the time. So it's nice to see people have already said hello on the chat. Well, please use it. Post any questions you've got for the speakers as you go along. And then we'll give you some chance towards the end of the session to ask your own questions. So if you want to raise your hand using the hand facility, and don't forget to unmute if we ask you to speak. Don't worry if your tech fails, because we're recording this so you can listen later. And feel free to use Twitter if you want to sort of carry on the conversations. We use hashtag QComQMS, and we also use the @Q community handle as well for that. And I said, don't worry if you get interrupted, it's fine, we're all used to it now. You know, don't worry if you have to drop off, but please come back if you can. Okay. So just a brief outline what we're doing today. So quick outline from me around what we've done so far. Then we'll hand over to Ruth to talk about how Healthcare Improvement Scotland's been looking at quality management systems in the context of leadership and learning. And then we'll be handing over to John, who'll be talking about some of the plans in Wales around developing quality management systems. We'll have a brief breakout, and then we'll hand over to David, who will give us some insights in what might be the conditions and the culture needed to lead for improvement. Joy will run a little bit of a panel session, and then Penny will close and review for us. Okay. So just to quickly run through, both Joy and I work in improvement day by day, and one of the things that's always struck us is why aren't improvement efforts sustained? So after lots of energy, lots of plans put in place, sometimes things just slip back to how they are. And that got us talking about quality management systems and thinking about how can we develop something that's much more robust and sustainable, that plans for quality, does the improvement, but then puts that into a control kind of system so that day by day we can be assured that we're delivering the quality we want. So that got us into developing this webinar series, and we've deliberately taken bits of that trilogy and looked at that in greater detail. So what does that mean, and where can we see really good practice running through the country? So our first webinar back in February was all around how you do this at an organisational level. What are some of the things you need to start thinking about quality and developing a purposeful system that might maintain and sustain and improve. And then our second webinar, we really looked at that quality planning aspect and how do you take the ambitions of the organisation and start to align people towards them. And then our webinar we've recently done in May was really looking at quality right at the workplace. So how do we make quality management system a reality as a daily routine? And today we're looking at leading for quality. So what does it take to lead in this kind of environment? Is it different? Are there different conditions we need? And how do we bring people along with us? So that's what we're focusing on today. So I'd like to hand over to Ruth. Ruth, I'll give you control of the screen. And Ruth, as I said, is Director of Improvement at Healthcare Improvement Scotland, and is responsible for a huge portfolio of improvement initiatives, as well as being an improver herself by background. So over to you, Ruth.
Thank you, Emma. I'm delighted to be here today with everyone. This has been a great series of seminars, so a real privilege to contribute to this. I want to start with a question to everyone, which is, hopefully the slides will move along. What, in your experience, gets in the way of effectively implementing a quality management approach in health and social care? So if you want to put your answers in the chat box, what gets in the way of quality management in your experience? Great, thank you, Richard. Starting to see comments coming through. Ingrained executive habits. Lack of leadership buy-in, silo working, performance targets, you're bored, lack of vision, lack of leadership. This is great, and it'll be fascinating at the end if we have the opportunity to theme some of these, but culture, change fatigue, leadership. So I think, as we would expect, actually, a lot of your own experience aligns very closely with what the research tells us gets in the way, which is that when it comes to healthcare, leadership behaviours and organisational culture is one of the biggest barriers to successfully implementing a quality approach. And the article cited there is a fascinating one to have a look at, because it delves into what is meant by that and includes highlighting the level of middle management turnover as being a real barrier in terms of that consistent approach to quality leadership. So this focus on culture and leadership behaviours is really important, and we know, and I think most of us on the call today will be aware of this, that's often called out, is that when it comes to improvement work, we often say that for the time that you spend on it, 80% of that time is spent on the people issues and 20% on the technical issues. But the reality is that the outcome is equally dependent on both. So this isn't a linear equation. It's not that if you spend 80% of your time on the relational, you get 80% of the outcome. You actually need both the relational and the technical working really well together to deliver us the outcomes. And we often talk in our work as them being an infinity loop. So they are so inherently interconnected. And this relational bit is where leadership cultures and leadership behaviours become so important in terms of, are they promoting sufficient focus on the relational side of the quality work? So in Scotland, we developed our high-level quality management system. For those of you who joined us on the first webinar, you will remember Michael Canavan talking through this. And we developed this very much by learning from experience, interviewing a range of folk from across the world, but also looking at the evidence base. And one of the things we're really clear on is the technical bit really matters, the planning, the quality control, the quality improvement. But if this is going to be successful, it has to be embedded in a culture which focuses on the importance of relationships and co-designing and co-producing services with the people who need, use and deliver care. And critical to enabling all of that is the leadership cultures. So if you want to know more about this, we recently published a document that delves into a bit more depth behind each of these domains. I should just say, we aren't trying to sell this as a model. We're very clear that what matters actually, or what mattered for us, was the process of developing this jointly. We would encourage any system to do the work to develop its own approach to quality management, to articulate it in a way that works for you. Because we get as much value out of that co-production as the end framework. So building on this idea that what we really need to be focusing on if we're going to sustainably do quality well is the management and leadership cultures. One of the things that we're talking about at the moment in our work is that if we're going to successfully recover our health and care systems on the back of the last 2 years, we have got to see a change in management leadership cultures. It is the biggest barrier to us actually delivering successfully improvement work at scale, is the management and leadership cultures. So this table calls out work that was done by John Seddon back in 2008, which I think is still as relevant today, where part of what he highlighted was that the primary culture in public services is the one on the left, command and control. And my experience is that that is still the case. That is the dominant culture across our health and social care system. But to deliver really high quality care, we need a management and leadership culture that is outlined on the right. So we need to shift on so many different categories, our beliefs, our behaviours and our practices. And actually, the second set of webinars were brilliant in calling out some of these leadership behaviours. So anyone who hasn't watched the second one of this series, I'd really encourage you to go back and watch. They talk about strategy deployment, but in talking about it, all of the speakers highlight really practical examples around how they have changed their management and leadership cultures to enable that improvement work to be successful and sustainable. So when I was listening to that, I thought, so where can I add value? Because I can't talk about the kind of approaches they did nearly as well as they do. So there's no point me doing it again and not doing it as well as them. Just watch those webinars. So I thought where I perhaps could add value is in some of the thinking about where we're at in Scotland around this, around the what matters and the learning aspects of this. So if we are to recover our health and social care system, we have got to, in our view, see a much, much stronger focus on person-centred redesign and improvement. And part of quality planning, a critical part of it that is often underestimated, is this bit on the left around taking the time to understand the needs and assets from our customer population perspective, and then designing services that genuinely meet those needs. And that's something that has to be at the heart now of all of our redesign and improvement work. What are the needs of the people using this service? How do we design our systems to meet those needs first time? And the reason why we think this is now so fundamental is because our health and social care system is riddled with failure demand from doing the wrong thing. Sometimes we can't see it because the way it presents to us doesn't look like failure demand. So if you take the example of an older person who may be admitted to an acute hospital because they've broken their hip, that looks like, you know, that's obviously there is a need there for a hip operation. It's only when we look in depth at that person's life that we realise the reason they broke the hip was because they were on a waiting list for 8 months for aids and adaptations, and they fell because they didn't have the appropriate equipment that would have prevented them from falling and breaking the hip. So, as I say, our proposition is actually that when you look at things through the lens of the people using services, what you actually see is that we are riddled with failure demand from doing the wrong thing, and that we need a fundamental redesign. Now, we're working very closely with the Centre for Public Impact at the moment around their work on human learning systems. And this is an example of an individual. This is a real person in real life who's been anonymised, and it just highlights the difference between what she wanted and the cost of providing what she wanted and what she actually received and the cost of providing what she received. And there is a risk in the quality management work that we focus so much on reducing unwarranted variation that we forget that variation in outcomes can be driven by a failure for us to respond appropriately to variation in individual needs. So it's not that we need to standardize everything. What we need to do is have services that are able to respond appropriately to variation in need and provide people with what they actually need first time. And that's one of the things we're now doing quite a bit of work on in Scotland. So very quickly, how are we doing that? So in part, how we're doing that is by trying to embed this approach to user journey experience mapping in all of our redesign work. So we start with deeply understanding the needs and assets of the people using the service. This is a real individual who's been anonymised. Very happy to share the wider journey map if people are interested afterwards. But this kind of user research really helps us to understand what people need. It's not about putting a group of stakeholders in a room together. It's actually about getting in and doing this deep user research to inform our redesign work. But to do that well, you require learning as the management strategy. And again, working with the Centre for Public Impact, part of what we are looking at here is how do we embed these interconnected planned experimentation at every level of the system, so that we start by experimenting on the ground with what we're delivering people, the services that we're delivering to people, so that we are really trying to understand their needs, that as individuals, particularly individuals with multiple complex needs, they sit as part of a wider system of care. So how do we co-design with them individual care plans and experiment till we get that right? And how do we take the learning from that to change how we design and deliver our services right through to what that might mean at a board level and right through eventually to a policy level? So again, if you go back to the second series of webinars, you could say, well, this is a form of catchball that was covered there. It is. I think the key for me, the additional add in this thinking is to be absolutely clear that as things are coming up through the system, it's not just about somebody fixing it, it's about how do we get experimentation at every level, because we're working with complexity, we often don't understand what's going to work. And we want our managers to be experimenting, we want our policymakers to be experimenting, but all of those experiments need to be connected back to the ground level to say, how are we making a difference on the outcomes for people using services? And here's some very practical examples of the 2 questions that need to be asked to make sure that the learning cycles at each level are connected. So this diagram was taken from a report. I've put the link in there on the slide, which gives a range of further practical examples. And in terms of evidence that this works, This is just some data from some of the work we've done around person-centred redesign in Healthcare Improvement Scotland. There's many more examples. I'm sure you can all highlight them. And I've also provided some links here to some webinars that also provide practical examples around the work that's very much embedded from a user research and redesigning services to really meet user needs first time, every time. So in summary, we would say that transforming our management leadership cultures is vital for effective and sustainable high quality care. I would say, for me personally, my biggest issue at the moment is this one. With the level of redesign we need to do across our health and social care system, we're not going to be able to do that using a top-down performance management approach. We have to have a transformation of management and leadership cultures. But how you do that is incredibly challenging, and there are reasons why it's so hard within a political system that we can go into more in the Q&A if folk have been interested. I think that how we do this is not going to be top down, actually, because this is a transformation that is going to happen, I think, bottom up. And what if we viewed transforming the health and care management leadership culture as a social movement driven by activists across the system? How would that change our thinking? Would we do anything differently to what we're doing now if we thought that this is actually a social movement? So, as I say, I think the only way this is going to happen is by every single one of us doing what we can and aligning in a social movement that absolutely preferences person-centered redesign, that has the individuals using services at the heart of everything that we are doing, that seeks to understand what their needs are and what assets they have, and has a program of redesign driven bottom up that is about delivering services to genuinely meet people's needs first time, every time. There is so much more that could be said here, so this is very much just a quick overview. And if you want to hear more about the work, please do follow the links to those webinars, because we have much more detail there around some of the specifics around practically how you do this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Gosh, lots there, and a real call to action, I think. So no doubt, as you've been listening, there've probably been things that you think, oh, I'd love to ask Ruth this. Well, take a note of them or write them in the chat, and in a few minutes time we'll have a chance to go to the panel. But I know we asked Ruth to do a real overview. We are hoping at some stage to be able to do something else that will go into deeper detail to that. But thank you very much, Ruth. I feel like I'm already part of a social movement, so yes, let's all join in and see what we can do. So because of time, I'm going to move us on to John now. So John is, as I say, a director in Public Health Wales, huge background in improvement. I first sort of heard of John and John's work at an Iron Bevan continuous improvement. I know that he's done a lot of work with Cardiff University as well to sort of take forward improvement. So it's great that John's able to join us. So John, I've given control over to you for the slides. So you should be able to start driving from now on. So over to you, John.
Thanks, Emma, and thank you, Ruth, for providing all of those slides. Fortunately, that picture actually does reinforce that at one point I did have dark hair, as opposed to it now being very grey, but I'm going to move on. So I'm going to just give you a quick sort of context in and around Wales and what we're doing in Wales around quality management and leadership for quality. So Wales has been on a real journey over the last sort of 6-7 years in and around quality. We've been doing quality improvement probably for the best part of 20 years, but I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time just talking through this slide, but there are a couple of important things to just pick up. So go back to 2016 when the OECD did a review of healthcare quality across the UK. Is one of the things it raised is that the infrastructure and capability for improvement and innovation within Wales was really lacking, which if you actually think we've been doing improvement and quality improvement for over a decade at that point, you'd probably argue was slightly concerning. In 2018, the parliamentary review suggested that the national team needed to reinvigorate itself and actually think about a different way of driving improvement, which is part of the reasons why 1,000 lives became Improvement Cymru. If you fast forward then to 2020, and it was right at the start of the pandemic, the Health and Social Care Act became law, and it was right in the middle of the first wave when it passed everybody by, but it will be expected that it will be implemented by the middle of next year. And that, along with the Quality Safety Framework, which was launched in 2021, really does drive up the notion of quality and the management of quality within organisations, with the expectation that all of the health boards and the trusts within Wales will need to start to think about embedding and implementing quality management systems more effectively within their organisations. So whilst we've been doing quality improvements within Wales for quite a number of years, there's a shift from thinking about just purely improvements to actually thinking about how do we manage more broadly for quality, as opposed to quality improvement in itself. Now, we've been on a bit of a journey ourselves as a national team, and one of the things that we did over the last several years is quite a large piece of research, which I think reinforces what's been discussed and described within the last webinars, and certainly some of the things that Ruth has described. So think about all of the organisations that you can sort of name that are really high performing organisations within healthcare. So they'll all describe almost universally the same thing. So that drive to quality management, it's a long journey, will fail, and it isn't easy. It takes, you know, years, if not decades. They often have a standardized approach, whether you go for lean, whether you go for the IHI improvement methodologies, etc., is that they often settle on one improvement approach that is standardized across the organization. Now, we talk about these, and we talk about the Durand trilogy: planning, control, improvement. They're all recognized terms, but they're not separate. They're often interweaved, and you don't find a planning department separate from an improvement department, etc. They are functions of the way that the organization operates. This is the one that probably changed the way that I think about driving improvement and quality on a national scale, is that when we looked at all of the organizations that drove transformation, whether it's, you know, Cincinnati Children's, whether it's Jönköping, whether it's, you know, the likes of Salford, is the focus on managing quality may have been triggered by something internally or externally, but it is universally led by the CEO and the board. And you know, this bottom up, yes, absolutely, we always have this bottom up notion, but you almost universally find that it's the chief executive and the board and the chair that actually drive it and signal the change. We all have hubs within our organizations, but it's not a directorate. It is a property of the organization. It's viewing the organization as a system in the way that it drives improvement. It's part of one wider framework, and then just the last couple of two, which I think is important. So you've got Ruth on the call, you've got myself on the call, both, you know, national directors within Scotland and Wales. You've got David, who, you know, has been doing this for many years, but at the same time is go through organizations. You need leadership throughout the organization. So whether that's at the front line or at board level and executive level, it goes throughout the organization. And then the last point, I think everybody will have said this over the last several seminars: openness and transparency with data for learning, not for judgment, is so important. And the research findings, whether you know, you read the literature, you interview all of those that have actually delivered high performing organizations, it's almost universally the same in terms of openness, transparency. So quick question for you, and I use this slide an awful lot when I'm engaging with organizations in Wales, whether it's boards or otherwise. On a scale of 1 to 5, where do you think your organization is? And just type in just very quickly where you think your organization is. I haven't got a huge amount of time, otherwise I'd spend the next half hour just on this slide alone, but I use this a lot to actually challenge where we think we are as organizations in terms of driving improvement and quality. So it's interesting what I'm seeing coming in on the chat. So almost universally is that you're saying you're a 2, a couple of you are saying you're a 2.5 or a 3. It's interesting is that we've been at quality and quality improvement in the UK for a long time. I started doing quality improvement, I think, in about 2003 with the Unscheduled Care Collaborative at that point, and yet we're still saying that we're only building high potential for improvement, but we're not at that point where we're innovation trailblazers. But I think this is really important, is look at the terms that are highlighted when you get up to 3 to 5. So organizational wide improvement approach, leaders, measurable, improvement culture, high performing organizations. These are all of the things that we're now starting to talk about, but they're all the things that we've probably to some extent neglected over the last decade or so. And what we've got is, you know, areas and people who've got real high potential for improvement, but we're not connecting it into the strategic issues that organizations have got at the moment, which is, you know, a real shift in the way that we're actually thinking about driving improvement work within Wales. Now, one of the things that we've got in Wales, lots of policies, lots of procedures. We've got the quality and safety framework, which has recently been launched. And if you look over on the right, that diagram looks remarkably similar to the diagram in from Scotland. We haven't stolen it, it's the Durand trilogy, but at the same time, it's very similar to the way that Ruth described it as a learning environment, but that blue circle around the outside is all of the culture and the behaviours that we need to actually really push and drive to actually embed that. We've got some really great policies, procedures to actually support planning, the integrated medium-term plans, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. But as we go further down that list of quality improvement, quality control, quality assurance, we've work to do as we get into Wales, and we're increasingly recognising that actually the leaders within organisations, whether that's at unit level all the way up to exec and director level, really needs to actually start to actually link up to this. And I think we'd all reflect that there's been a disconnect between the improvement work, the quality work that we see within organisations, and the real drive from the senior leadership, and the way that we now start to actually link the improvement work to the strategic issues that organisations have got. I think this is where there's a real connection. So one of the things that I think is also a challenge now, I think one of the seminars previously is that we talked about policy deployments. Lean has got a really good quality management system that if you can embed it and implement it within organisations is really, really useful. Beyond that, if you've got the Durand trilogy, it looks amazing on paper, but there's no recipe book, there's no guideline about how you build it, and it's something that actually often evolves and is sometimes at times challenging. So just a couple of slides just to finish off, just to help you describe and just think through how we're doing it in Wales. So we've been really fortunate over the last 6 months in that we've recently developed a partnership with the Institute for Healthcare Improvement in driving safety and patient safety and care forwards in Wales. And the first thing that we have done is that I've recognised that there's a real lack of capability for patient safety improvement and improvement leadership at that senior level, sitting just below the executives, that enables a conduit into the executives, but equally at the same time is feedback into the organisations. So we've recently trained 35 senior leaders across Wales in a patient safety programme, which is similar to the IHI's executive patient safety programme. It's a little bit shorter than that, but we've got assistant medical directors, nurse directors, etc. within that programme, and we've now created a network where we've got a really active network of senior leaders that are going through that, which is active. Now we're linking them into the site visits. So we're currently in the process of doing diagnostics to understand how organisations are performing at the moment. And again, is that we're linking those senior leaders in, so they're learning what's happening, but also able to feed into their executive teams. We're needing to build capability again. I think over the course of the pandemic, we've really struggled with capability, and we've lost some of the skill sets that we had pre-pandemic. But again, is that we're linking the coaches back into the senior leaders, and at the same time, as we get towards the collaborative towards the end of the year, we'll have the leadership really well represented, because there's such a need to actually represent the senior leaders within the improvement work. And then the final thing, and the final slide for me, and again, I'm happy to pick up any queries, questions as we move to the panel session. As I said a couple of slides ago, is that method for thinking about quality management is often lacking, and it's often something that we're needing to learn our way in. we've settled on a quality management process within Improvement Cymru. We're just starting to undertake it within Public Health Wales, and then starting to share it with wider organisations, called Quality as a Business Strategy, or Quality as an Organisational Strategy. It's based on the original work of Deming. His organisation viewed as a system. I believe it was used during Pursuing Perfection a number of years ago, but we're starting to utilise this in Wales now, and starting to really bear some really interesting conversations, and really starting to drive the way that we think about how we move things forward. Certainly within Wales and Improvement Cymru at the moment. Hopefully, if we fast forward 12 months time, we can share some of the information, detail and learning about how we've embedded it within other organisations. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you very much, John. Yeah, we will certainly be contacting you to see how this goes. There's a lot there, and it's really interesting to see how your organisation's starting to pick this up, think about it, and starting to sort of push you towards higher levels of improvement maturity. So it was really useful to see that, and to think, oh, where might my organisation be on all that. What we're going to do is give you a little bit of time right now, just to sort of meet some other people who might be on the call, and say hello, and just to have a few minutes to think, you know, what have you heard from Ruth? What have you heard from John? What's that making you think about your organisation or where you may be? And if you can, it'd be great if someone from your group could just give us a little bit of feedback in the Zoom chat, which Joy will pick up for our breakouts, our panel session later. Shara's going to put you all into breakout rooms. I will stop sharing. And please take the opportunity to meet some people you don't already know. So Shara, if you don't mind sending us all off to rooms for 15 minutes, that would be great. We're bringing people back from the breakout rooms now. Thank you, Charles. So as you come back, it'd be really useful if you've got any questions to stick them in the chat, and we can pick them up for later. So yeah, Joyce just put that in the chat. So as you come back, what kind of things were you thinking of? What did you discuss? Any burning questions that have occurred to you? And we'll try and pick them up as we go along. So how are we doing, Shara? Is everyone back?
Yeah, that's everyone.
Right, okay, so I've already seen just a little bit in the chat. So please, if there's some questions, if you think, I'd really like to know this, or how, you know, what are some of the things that these senior leaders might feel are important, please do put that in the chat and we'll pick that up in a minute. I'm sure you've had some useful discussions. Apologies if it was too short. So I'm going to hand us over to David now. So David spent a long time working in improvement, one of the early trailblazers with Royal Bolton and Royal Bolton Improvement Capability System, and then previously with AQuA and developing their improvement capability across the Northwest and much, much wider. So David, you've got a huge amount of experience. Can I hand over to you and hear some of your thoughts on leadership and improvement?
Yeah, thank you, Emma. I'm slightly nervous about the very big build-up, I have to say, but it's very kind of you. I really enjoyed both Ruth and John's contributions, and there's a huge amount of what they said that I would agree with. And I thought a lot of the comments coming to the chat box were interesting and very relevant as well. I've been interested throughout the whole of my career, initially in manufacturing and then 30 plus years in healthcare, about how do you really build a system and a culture for improvement that supports, engages staff, and indeed expects staff to improve the work that they do every single day. And I've tried to do that in organisations that I've led with varying amounts of success. I've supported others to do it via AQuA and by my work with NHSI. And most recently, I've been working with Lancashire and South Cumbria as a provider collaborative, a collection of 5 foundation trusts, but now with the places and the ICS as well, as they begin to develop the version of a quality management system. Slightly surprisingly, given the topic of this webinar, though, I'm going to start by saying I have some concerns about the use of the phrase quality management system and the way in which we can frame our approach to it. I'm also going to buck the trend by not using PowerPoint slides, although there is going to be, I think Emma's going to put into the chat box later on a link to an article that I had published in the BMJ Leader at the back end of last year about leadership for improvement. So I'm going to do 3 things. I'm going to briefly, just as context, describe the work that's underway in Lancashire and South Cumbria. But then I'm going to move on to outline those concerns I mentioned about the QMS as a framework, whilst acknowledging a lot of good can come out of it. But then I'm going to spend most of my time on some suggestions about how we can mitigate the concerns I'm raising, and particularly about the role of leaders in all of that. And I mean leaders at every single level in the organisation. I don't just mean board directors, I mean the physio team leader or the porters supervisor. I mean leadership at every single level in the organisation. So with Lancashire and South Cumbria, I've been working with them for about a year, and it started by them asking me to work with the 5 trusts to think about how they might develop a shared approach to improvement and transformation. A shared method actually was the thing that they asked. And having talked to people there, my reflection back to them was that it wasn't just about a method. As some of you may be familiar with the bridge model developed by Cardiff Business School. So those of you who go hill walking in the Lake District or Wales or the Peak District like I do, will have seen these pack horse bridges with a stone pillar on one side of the river and a stone pillar on the other and a beautiful stone arch over the top. So one pillar is your improvement method, and that's important. And as John said in his comments, having some consistency in the application of your method is important. The pillar on the other side is your management system, and I tend to use that phrase rather than quality management system for reasons I'll explain, but that's how you link improvement to your biggest priorities. And then the arch over the top, which actually without which the 2 pillars never connect, is leadership and is culture. And in Lancashire and South Cumbria, we've been working on all 3 of those. So develop a shared method using the engineering better care model that some of you may be familiar with. Develops a collaboration between the Royal Society of Engineers and the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges, and that's useful because whilst it's got improvement methods and tools in it, a lot of it is about systems thinking perspectives. We've been working on leadership behaviours with the support of NHS England and improvement, and lastly the development of our own system leadership and organisational development strategy. And we've been developing a management system, which people were keen to call a quality management system, very similar to the models that Ruth and John have described, based on Duran, linking planning, improvement, control, and assurance, with the idea of doing each of those better, but breaking down the silos within which we normally do them. And we've been working in Lancashire and South Cumbria on 3 implementation programmes, seeking to get a more standardised approach towards service and team accreditation, create an all-share, all-learn learning network around CQC inspections, and I think most excitingly, using the engineering better care model for an end-to-end home-to-home redesign of the services for patients who are living with frailty and with respiratory illness. And all 3 of those are at an early stage, but the aim is to develop the system. I mean, we did some good early work, but my reflection back to the team was what we had was an interesting set of PowerPoint slides, which, to be honest, is part of the reason I'm not using PowerPoint slides with you today. This is about making it real and adopting a learning by doing approach, and that's what we are seeking to do. So given I'm doing that work, paradoxically, why did I say I have concerns about the phrase QMS? Well, Ruth asked you right at the beginning, what are the obstacles to quality management? And a lot of the reasons that you put in the chat box are why I've got concerns, but I would group them under 3 headings. The first is that I think when you call it a QMS or a quality management system, people think it's a thing, it's a technical development. And a lot of people, particularly people who aren't themselves improvers, assume if we buy one of these and put it in, it will magically fix all of our problems. Whereas Ruth said, what you need to do is far much more relational than it is technical. There are technical aspects and we need to get those right. But we mislead people, I think, by making it sound as though it's simply a technical solution. Secondly, not only that, it sounds technocratic. And when I talk to frontline staff, you put the words quality management and system together into the same sentence and their eyes glaze over. It's not the language they talk, it's not what they're interested in. And thirdly, calling it a quality management system, for me, minimises what it can do, because I think it's about the whole way in which we lead the whole of our organisations and systems. And we should be thinking about that quadruple aim of improved health and reduced inequalities, better quality care in all its dimensions, better value for the taxpayers' money that we spend, and joy and pride in work for the staff who we work with. So for me, quality management system narrows it down too much. So I've got all that off my chest now, and I know it's outrageous to come to a QMS webinar and say why we shouldn't call it a QMS, but I felt there are some important points in that. So if you think those points are important, what can we do about them? And I suppose the first thing is to recognise the risk. And in Lancashire and South Cumbria, we're just now having that conversation. We're beginning to say, maybe we've been positioning this wrong and we need to reposition it. So with the Foundation Trust, the places, the ICSs, we're having a conversation about what is it we're really trying to achieve here. And I would suggest that there are actually 4 questions that we should pose to ourselves. So if the first is what are we trying to achieve, the conclusion we're reaching in Lancashire and South Cumbria is that what we really want is a system and culture for improvement at every level. So every member of frontline staff is encouraged and supported to improve the work that they do every day. But then also when we're tackling the biggest challenges that we face, the lack of integration between physical and mental health, the huge service pressures and backlogs that we've got coming out of COVID, the staff shortages, let's use an improvement method to work on those together. So doing both the big things, the big leaps, and the small steps, using an improvement focus and gearing it towards that quadruple aim. But recognising that the QMS bit of it is only one element. It's one tool, it's not the whole thing. And the system leadership behaviours and the correct application of the method are the other bits in our bridge. The second question is, if what we are trying to do is create an improvement culture, what does that look like? And I guess you've probably all got experience in organisations that do have that culture and don't. So my experience in organisations that don't have an improvement culture, if they get an organisational quality problem, say they've got a sudden run of critical incidents or high levels of pressure ulcers, or they've got patients attending A&E with a mental health problem, spending far too long in A&E and not being moved on, the kind of default response of organisations without an improvement culture is you get a group of people together who don't really know the problem, are close to it, called managers. You take them out of the workplace, you deprive them of data, everybody tells anecdotes, and then you get a decision by what's called monoboxoplagia for any Greek scholars. So that means domination by a single loud voice, and that's how the decision is made. It's not always the most senior person, by the way. Now that's a caricature. I'm sure none of the organisations on this call work in that kind of way, but I have to say organisations I've worked in, and so I have to say at times led, have aspects of that. And an improvement culture is quite different to that. In an improvement culture, the people who are going to solve the problem are the frontline staff because they know it best. The solving of the problem is done as close to the actual workplace as possible. you gather data and analyse it to understand the problem before you start to develop solutions. And then you test solutions by gathering data and reflecting on it. And you make decisions through those rapid PDSA cycles till you achieve a consensus. And those are they're not just sort of different ways of describing problem solving, they're radically different ways of running organisations. And if we're going to really create an improvement culture, I think we have to fundamentally change the way we lead our healthcare organisations and systems. So if the first question is, what are we trying to achieve with our QMS? And the second question is, it is an improvement culture, what is that? I suppose my third question is, so what do leaders do and not do to either foster an improvement culture or to inhibit it? And you might, hopefully people will put your own ideas about this into the chat box, what leaders can do to promote an improvement culture and what behaviours get in the way. And there's a lot published on this. In my experience, in that first example, the organisation without an improvement culture, the leaders are quite unhappy as well, because the leaders are trapped in their offices or in meetings, or these days trapped on Teams meetings. They're smothered by emails and they interpret the world through PowerPoint slides. And so when they do need to try and get action to happen, as I think Ruth said in her comments, they tend to issue instructions. They use performance management approaches, and the language they use involves words like grip and delivery. In an improvement-focused organisations, actually, it's tough for leaders to find the time to do this, but it's much more fun. They spend less time in meetings, less time on Teams. They get out and about around the workplace. When they're out there, they're asking questions, they're adopting a coaching approach, they're supporting, they're inspiring change. And they're establishing a daily, weekly rhythm of improvement using visual management, using huddles, using PDSA cycles. And their language is language about learning and reflection and improvement. And this is leaders at every level. And John's point was that chief executives and board have to set an example. I do think you can have middle-out leadership, but I think if you've got chief executives and executives spending time around the organisation, asking questions, coaching, being visible, that cascades through everybody. So my fourth question is, so what support the leaders need from us and from the system in order to achieve this? Well, a lot of leaders, when I have this conversation with them, say, this sounds great, we'd love to do it, we just don't have the time. Well, let's apply our own improvement methods to generate the time then. Let's do our driver diagram as to how the time is getting wasted. Back when I was running a trust, we set ourselves a very ambitious goal to reduce the number of meetings by 30%, reduce the number of people who had to attend the meeting by 30%, and reduce the length of each meeting by 30%. We didn't achieve them, but we did succeed in freeing up quite a bit of time. And then the guide, the steer was, you spend that time out and about around the organisation, listening, coaching, inspiring improvement. Secondly, then, I think leaders do need that mentoring and coaching at every level. That should be the job of leaders, to support the people who they work with to do improvement better. And then thirdly, we need good programmes that give people the skills, the behaviours, the habits to lead for improvement. And again, there's some great stuff published on that, whether it's the Health Foundation's Habits of an Improver or Michael West's work on compassionate leadership. And probably the one thought I would leave with you, I set up no PowerPoint slides, but I think Emma is going to put into the chat box a link to an article I published by BMJ Leader in December last year, where they kindly said, you're very old now, David, and semi-retired. What are your reflections on a career's worth of trying to do this stuff? So I summarise that as 6 Ps, the 6 Ps of trying to lead for improvement, which won't be any surprise, I suspect, to the people on this call. So my 6 Ps were purpose, be really clear what it is you're trying to achieve, articulate that in a way that's going to inspire action from people, and be consistent and constant in the way you put that across. The second P is patience, stay in really constant touch with what it really feels like, what the experience is like, and co-produce, co-design new services and new ways of doing things with the people that we serve. The third P is people. Our really good leaders are people. They actually do show people courtesy and dignity and respect, and they get the basics right, and they know how to infuse and inspire and support and coach. The fourth P is processes, making sure they are safe and reliable, but recognising that all work is a process and all processes can be improved, and that's what our improvement tools are for. The fifth P is partnerships, and those can be internal within a trust, the multi-professional, multi-departmental partnerships that we need to get patients flowing in a smooth, safe, high-quality way across our organisations. Or increasingly, as we develop, certainly in England, the ICS approach and system working, partnerships that are multi-sectoral, working with colleagues in general practice, social care, physical and mental health working together. And my final P, which perhaps may not seem to fit with all of that, is politics. Not politics with a capital P, but using political skills not to further our own careers, but to realise that higher purpose, to support improvements in care for patients. And political skills are about creating an inspiring vision, but they're also about understanding where power lies, building coalitions of support, getting things done. So, in conclusion, to reiterate, despite my apparent initial scepticism, I do think the quality management system can be useful. I do think we need to get better at planning and improvement, and control and assurance, and we need to connect them together better. But I would emphasise very strongly that that needs a cultural and transformational focus, not just a transactional one. And actually, it's all about the role of leaders at every single level in shaping the culture and in leading our organisations in a very different way. I think just on my screen, what popped up was what was the first P in the chat box. It's purpose. So my 6 Ps were purpose, patients, people, processes, partners, and politics. Thank you very much for inviting me today. I think it's been a great conversation. I've loved hearing about it, and I'm going to hand back to Emma now. So I think we're going to have a bit of a panel chat before we wrap up.
Thank you very much, David. The link to the article that David talked about has been posted a couple of times in the chat now, but it'll also be on the slides when you get when we record everything and put them on the AQuA website as well. So do have a look at that. And thank you very much, David. And now Joy is going to lead a little bit of a panel discussion, picking up some of the questions that have been popping up in the chat. Some great participation, which is lovely. So over to you, Joy.
Yes, so lovely. Thank you, everybody, so far. I've enjoyed listening to all of that. There's been loads of questions popping up, so I've been trying to capture some of those. I'm conscious that we have 15 minutes to get through as many questions as we can, everyone. So I'm going to start with the first question that came up, which was, how do we think that we can effectively align senior leadership expectations with getting started with quality management of whichever brand or label we want to give it? And I'm wondering if we might go in speaker order in terms of answering it. So Ruth, do you think that's something you could perhaps start with? How do we think we might align what leaders do with people starting to develop quality management systems? So I think it's a question about leadership support.
So I think always with leadership support, it's about the will, isn't it? And how do you generate that will? And if you've got a leadership team who aren't on board, then for me, that's the place to start in terms of showing why this matters for them and what matters to them. So something really important about being able to demonstrate to leaders that this approach is going to deliver for the things that matter to them. We talked in our little breakout group that one of the things that can really help there is actually if you can take them to other places that are doing it really well, or expose them, because if you haven't got any will at all, then it can be really quite difficult to get them interested to actually go and visit somewhere. But it's how we expose our leaders to the benefits of the approach, but see that the starting point really is influencing. It's getting the will of the leaders initially, and then you can start to layer everything else on top of that.
Lovely, lovely answer. So, John, I wondered if you want to add anything to that.
I'm probably going to reinforce what Ruth said is I think there's a real need to engage them. I think one is to listen to what their frustrations are and actually think about how we align the two together. I think there is a real need for us to take them to see what good looks like. And, you know, I think it is one of the things that in Wales, we're very good at looking at how good Wales is. We don't always cross the border to see what's going on in England, Scotland and Northern Ireland and Ireland and beyond. I think the other one as well, and I did this a couple of months ago, is actually take the leaders to the front line and actually, you know, get them to walk in the, you know, a mile in the shoes of a nurse who is, you know, on a shift when, you know, if they're understaffed, they've got a horrendously overburdened clinical load, and actually that get them to really understand. And I did this with 2 executives about 3 months ago, and the first question is why would we do that? And at the end of it, they just went, I had no idea. So there is something about actually really pulling on the leaders. Is they're actually very interested. I believe leaders are interested. I don't think that they're the laggards on the diffusion of innovation curve at all. They're the ones that have got to take the risk, but what we have to do is really communicate with them and help them understand what's going on.
Lovely, thank you very much, John. Now, David, I'm just going to switch the question very slightly for you. So those of you who don't know, I've worked with David before at Bolton Hospital. So I was in the luxurious position, I think, of having a very engaged chief executive. So I'm curious, David, what do you think sometimes we need to do to engage not just that board and executive layer, but maybe the next level down? You're on mute, David, I'm afraid.
This is a really tricky one, because I think there certainly are things that we need to do. And I think we actually need a national leadership development strategy that puts leadership for improvement centre stage. And we need to think about the way in which we develop job profiles and we recruit people into chief exec and executive director positions. And we need to think about rewarding and promoting the people who are actively engaged in improvement activity. You remember, Joy, when back in the Bolton days, we were one of the first trusts to flip the Consultant Excellence Awards. So there was a really strong focus on improvement rather than some of the other things. So we can do all of that, but there's a little bit that concerns me if we're not careful, that we say we can't progress any of this unless the chief exec and the exec director of the board are all on side. And actually, there's something about the inspiring nature of middle out change. I remember visiting a trust once that were doing some great improvement work, and when I asked how did they get started, it started because a radiologist went off and did a master's degree in improvement, and she came back and transformed the radiology department. And then other clinicians went to say, how are you managing to do that? This is fantastic, let's learn from it. And it almost spread organically to the point where senior leaders went, well, why don't we do this everywhere? This is great. So I think that there are things we can do, and some of it are about our people systems, but let's just get on with it and make a start, I think.
Lovely. Well, great question and great answer. Thank you for those of you in that breakout room with that question. Right, so I'm going to move on to the next question. So John, I'm going to start with you this time, if that's all right. So the next question really was about habits. So what are the habits that you really think might make a difference to developing this kind of improvement culture, habits that leaders need to have?
I'm going to say consistency, but then I'm going to probably say something else in a second. So I think consistency, I think the other one is visibility. I think people want to see the senior leaders out on the floor, and actually that they understand and are seeking to understand what the problems are. So I'm going to say consistency, but then I'm going to probably counteract it. So consistency and approach, but at the same time is altering your communication and leadership style depending on where you are in your improvement program. And one of the things that I'd say is that we often talk about the diffusion of innovations curve, which goes throughout the whole of the improvement world, but there's a chasm somewhere that sits that we've got to cross. And a lot of the way that we cross the chasm is the way that we start to change the conversation from I'm enabling you to do improvements to we're doing it as an organization, what do I need to do to support? And I think there's a shift there, but I think it's a consistent way that we actually think about doing that. Does that make sense?
Okay,
so something about communication there, I think. Joy.
Yeah, thank you. We're getting good ideas if we do these again here from these questions. That's brilliant. Thank you, John. David, would you like to add anything to that about leadership habits for improvement?
Yeah, obviously I said some of this in my contribution, so not a lot to add, but it's interesting. Toyota have a really nice way of framing this, don't they, where they say that there are three aspects to the behaviours that they want to see from their leaders: go and see, ask why, and give responsibility, and do that consistently on a regular rhythm. So get out from behind the PowerPoint slides and the Teams meetings, get out into the workplace, whatever your workplace is defined as. And when you're there, ask a lot of questions and be curious, but then do not do what I see a lot of leaders do, which is say, I will take that problem away and fix it. Then say to the staff, gosh, this is really serious. Tell me what you're going to do about this. What experiments are you going to try out? What support do you need from me? I'll come back next week and see how you're getting on. It's a very different way for our leaders to think that. But if we could just do those three things, I think, go and see, ask why, give responsibility, and make a big difference.
Lovely answer. Right. And Ruth, anything from you on this question?
I think just to add on top of it, one of the things I've been thinking about quite a bit recently is the importance of the growth mindset, and actually the importance of recruiting and promoting for that growth mindset. So that belief actually that as individuals we can learn and grow, because I've noticed when working with teams where there's difficulties, it's often in a context where folk are externalizing responsibility, and it's that everything is everybody else's fault rather than that belief actually that there's something that we can do about this. And I'm also conscious that Microsoft at one point went through a massive cultural transformation and had a real focus on this issue of a growth mindset. So it's in the early stages of thinking. So, but I think there's something important there. And I think there's something important building what David was saying about who we recruit to these leadership posts and how we recruit people who have that learning approach built into them, who are able to say, I got things wrong, who are able to take responsibility and who have a mindset of development and growth.
Oh, lovely. Very nice. Right, everybody, we're on the last question because we're going to run out of time. So, David, I'm going to start with you. And this links a bit, Ruth, actually, with one of the things you said people might want to come back to in the Q&A. So the question is, how do we balance this kind of the need to deal with the now, the big waiting list, the meeting the targets, the immediate safety concerns that we all have, with the thinking space and the slack, if you like, for the future of building systems for improvement or whatever label we want to give it, and how we create the space for involving staff, service users, and so on. So it's kind of finding the balance between the two. So David, I'm going to start with you, please. Oh, you're on mute again, I'm afraid.
A number of times I share things and tell people that, so you've got your revenge on me, Joe. It's an incredibly difficult thing to do, is the answer. I think, I'm sure there's lots of improvement people on the call, so you've probably seen the fantastic video of building the plane while flying it. And that's exactly how this feels. I think we've got to keep this jetliner in the air while we're still building it. And that's really not an easy thing to do. And I don't underestimate the challenge of it, but the alternative is to kind of give in and just be in the here and now, and just be dealing with the waiting times and with the pressures on A&E and with the pressures on general practice, and we never ever break out of the cycle. So I think the how comes back to one of the things I said before about thinking about the waste in our own management and leadership processes. Where is the time being spent, and is that time really adding value? And then being really disciplined about freeing some time up, and then even more disciplined about not just freeing the time up to spend on yet more firefighting, but actually saying we're going to use some of that time for dedicated work on thinking about the future and bringing the future into being. And the final thing I would say is, it's true that we're going to have to do some things in a fairly old-fashioned way to fix really pressing problems whilst we're building a new way of doing things. And we need an honest conversation with people about that, because otherwise it gets really confusing.
Oh, lovely. Great answer. Right, Ruth, would you like to add anything to that?
Just two things to add. So firstly, what we're finding using the 3 horizons model thinking is helping people to understand that working on the fixing the current problems together with the horizon 3 being that much more fundamental rethink, and just giving them that language helps people to think about which horizon am I working on, and that there needs to be that balance between them. I think most folk will be familiar, but if not, it's a really good model that's worth Googling. I think that my other observation would be, so one of the problems why the performance management culture prevails is because it works in the short term. And that's why we see so much of it, because from a political perspective, if you want results now in one particular area, it is the thing that's going to deliver the quickest results in that area. The problem with it is it often works in the short term, but creates bigger problems longer term, or creates problems in another bit of the system. So I think one of the challenges for us as improvers is how do we make the consequences of that short-term approach more visible, so that we have an understanding at a more senior level that it doesn't work actually from a systems perspective, and it doesn't work in the longer term, because we have to find the time, as the question asked, to do that longer term work. And part of finding that time is getting an acceptance that some things actually are going to need to stay at a poor performance level for the next 6 months whilst we do the redesign work, because that's going to deliver the gains in the longer term. So it's an incredibly wicked question. We've struggled with it for the last 20 years in improvement. There aren't any easy answers. And then I also find myself wanting to contradict and say, you know, it's both and as well. You've got to deliver something politically in the short term, but maybe we have to get clever about what it is we deliver in the short term, so we're not doing the things that are causing long-term harm.
Oh, lovely. What an answer. There's definitely another webinar on this question, isn't there? John, last point over to you, and then we're going to move over to Penny to finish off. So anything you would like to add?
Yeah, a couple of things for me. Stop training NHS graduates to plan for average and to work in tailorized systems as one. I think two, and you know, Penny's right. Ruth, forgive me, Ruth. The 3 horizons model is, so there's, you know, short term, medium term, long term. As part of that is, yes, we need to get the system safe now, but at the same time is engage with primary care. We need to bring in social care to what we're doing at the moment. We're not having enough conversations with social care. And at the same time, as we bring in social care, we're going to have to completely reframe the language of improvement and quality, because it is a completely different beast. But we need to start those conversations now, as opposed to waiting 2 or 3 years down the line when we've started to get some of secondary care safer.
Yeah, lovely thinking. Right, thank you all to the panel, and thank you to all the other questions that have come in the chat while you've been talking. Clearly we're not going to be able to get to them all now, but Emma and I will reflect on those later and see, as we get into Penny's discussion now, about how those questions might help us think about what we might do next. So thank you all very much. Emma.
Thank you. So we're going to ask Penny to close. Penny, are you there? Yes.
Yes, I am.
Yes. Do you want your slides, or would you just like to speak?
No, I'll use the slides. If Shara, are you able to share them for me? Or
yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, I'll do them, and I will. You start talking, and I'll get you into the position where you can.
Oh, brilliant.
If that's okay.
What a lovely. Yeah. So that the next slide would be great.
Right. You should now have control.
Okay. Excellent. Okay, so it's real pleasure to be able to wrap up this series, even if that's obviously tinged with a bit of sorrow of it coming to an end for now. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes looking back at the highlights across the series as a whole, and then thinking about how we can take it forward with InQ. I don't know how many of the sessions you managed to join. I only made it to 2 live, but the recording and the write-up on the website is really, really helpful. I think across the series we've had over 400 people. So these were the 4, as Emma outlined at the start. I'm going to canter through a couple of highlights of each as a reminder, but I'm conscious we're nearly at time, so I'll keep it very, very brief. It would be great if you could share your highlights in the chat as I do. So the first slide was looking at quality management at organisational level. We touched on how that in effect is about the whole management system of the organisation, with leadership driving the system, setting the culture, creating receptive conditions for change. I'm going to spin through these quickly, but hopefully these slides will be useful afterwards. Webinar 2 turned to thinking about aligning people around strategy, policy deployment, helping translate those strategic objectives into daily work, allowing people to see that place in the organisation. So some of the themes that we've picked up today on the style of leadership that's needed to enable kind of genuinely aligned innovation were coming up there. And then if you remember, the third webinar looked at making quality management part of an organisation's daily reality, touching on that kind of rigour, the discipline and commitment needed, the role of middle managers in coaching improvement. Again, some really key points that we've picked up today. And that led us into today's session, so it felt really fitting that we concluded with a focus on leadership at all levels, recognising how significant it was across the series. I guess it's the sign of a rich webinar that I feel like I need to think hard before I can do a half decent job of summarising, so I won't try to do that, but again, we'd love to see your reflections, what stood out to you in the chat. And as you do that, I just want to look forward slightly. So, given the level of interest that we're seeing in quality management systems, if you accept that terminology, in the Q community, we're considering continuing our work in this. We'll be guided by you on what's going to be most helpful. So again, please do add in the chat or follow up over email with what you would value. So are further webinars helpful? Are there other things that we could do? For example, we're thinking about a kind of short summary video of the content of the series so far. We run site visits in Q, so are there opportunities for us to do site visits linked to that? We've got special interest groups, different kinds of learning space. So what kind of thing would be helpful, and what topics would you like to see more on? And then, looking beyond this series, this is one of the many things that we do in Q that's open to all. So that means there's a kind of mix of people here who are Q members and not. To make the most of what Q has to offer, please do consider joining. So, there are lots of leaders grappling with these kind of strategic improvement questions. Q creates a safe peer space to learn with others doing similar work across the UK and Ireland. And I think Q can be a way in which you can connect with other people working in your local organisation and system, kind of help actually take through to implementation some of the things that we've been talking about. And then I just want to flag that, we are in parallel helping to do a bit of creating the conditions for that different leadership style and the quality management approaches that we've talked about. So for example, we use insight from members doing the work of improvement to influence policy in these areas. At a local level, we're working with NHS providers on a programme aimed at boards. Through you're leading the way in thinking about quality management and leadership for quality. Can we be the people who can help shift practice? So I guess what I want to say is I'm hoping that you'll keep an eye out for other events through Q that will be relevant, whether that's specifically about quality management or other areas. But don't just see Q as that. See Q as the opportunity to be the heart of that kind of social movement that Ruth called for. Okay, so as we close this series, we're going to end as usual with a poll to get your feedback. But first, before I do, really important to say some thank yous. So thank you very much today for our speakers, Ruth, John and David. Thanks to Shah and those in the Q team who make this webinar run so smoothly. And I'd like to thank all of you who kind of participated via the chat, and I hope will go on and share what you've picked up. And then as we close this series, I would be particularly like to thank Emma and Joy, who have made it happen with such style, such skill throughout. Again, sign of a great webinar. We've got lots to cover. We're at time.